Moving on with the second screencast of the first chapter, the next theoretical perspective in sociology is conflict. And unlike structural functionalists, the basic assumption underlying a conflict approach is that the history of all societies has been one of conflict in social life. So as a distinction, I put a little table here to talk about structural functionalist assumptions versus conflict assumptions. Both of these examine the same society, but they're like opposite heads, opposite parts of the same coin. On the one side, we have structural functionalism, and their approach is that there is a degree of consensus about the values, the norms, and the beliefs in society. And people sort of get on board with those things and follow normative behavior. From a conflict perspective, they say there are numerous disadvantaged people in society, that we have major inequality. We have very wealthy haves, and we have a whole lot of people at the bottom who simply have not. From a structural functional approach, the institutions in society have a function to contribute to the order, the maintenance, and the stability of society. From a conflict perspective, they wouldn't argue with that. They would say that there is an attempt in part of capitalist systems to create an orderly, stable society. But that also is a society that reproduces the patterns of inequality, and it's partly those patterns of inequality that contribute to the production of a stable society. But an assumption in the conflict approach is that the capitalist society has sown the seeds of its own destruction, and there are so many people who are disadvantaged that eventually what will happen is that there will also be instability. Of course, we've seen that since 2008 and the financial meltdown. We'll talk about some of those examples. From a structural functional approach, just about everybody buys into the social contract. They buy into the status quo, into the lifestyle, into consumer society. And by most people buying into that, even if disadvantaged, that maintains the stability in the order in society. Essentially, from a conflict approach, the status quo is a social structure which serves the interests of society's privileged groups. It helps maintain their positions of power and authority, and what they're essentially doing is exploiting the masses. They own most of the property, they own most of the capital, they accumulate most of the wealth and the profits at the expense of a lot of people in society who make that wealth as workers in factories and in information technology and so on. From a structural functional approach, maintaining the status quo is the important thing. Having equilibrium is the important thing. Having institutions that functionally provide the requisite needs of society working is the important thing, and that rocking the boat just creates disequilibrium. From a conflict perspective, rocking the boat will decrease privilege and lower inequality, and there's resistance to that by individuals who are at the apex of our society in terms of wealth, prestige, and power. We can trace the origins of the conflict approach to the writings of Karl Marx, and one landmark document in particular called the Communist Manifesto. The first line of the Communist Manifesto says this. This is like a reiteration of the conflict approach. First principle: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, or we can say that as the history of class conflict. Marx was writing a little bit earlier than Durkheim. We can trace the historical roots of functionalism to Durkheim, but what Marx did was he broadly asserted that class conflict was at the center of his ideas, and essentially it revolves around the distribution of wealth in society. It's about money, it's about the economy, it's about ownership of property, it's about the ownership of capital. Marx's analysis essentially is univariate, is one variable. It's this concentration of wealth, capital, that creates conflict, social inequality. And it's the analysis of those things at the larger societal level which makes it a macro-analytical approach to the study of society. So even though in the Communist Manifesto, one of the things that Marx and Engels was doing was predicting, advocating for a revolution of the proletariat, or the masses of people who are being exploited by the wealthy, conflict theorists today don't necessarily write revolutionary treatises. They look at all the same aspects of society that functionalists take a look at, but their lens or their filter is about how to support or maintain the order and stability in society. That's what functionalists do. Conflict theorists see the existing order, all of the social inequality, as a result of class conflict. And they advocate that the society needs to change. They see those who buy into this dominant ideological notion about going to school, going to university, accumulating a debt, buying a house, getting out and working for a living, paying off your debts, are people who are buying into the status quo. And essentially not everybody can follow that ideal. In fact, most people can't. So the rest of us, quite literally, are being exploited, and class consciousness and class struggle remain central to this analysis. And one of the ways in which we can see evidence of that would be in the Occupy Wall Street movement that occurred a few years ago, and then various kinds of protests that people have engaged in since then. One of the ways in which we take a look at the social structure in society is to take a look at the distribution of income. Who has what kind of money? So here's a little bit of blurb. I've got data that's more recent than this that we'll look at in other chapters when we talk about social inequality, but here are some data about who owns what. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development notes that the world has become a whole lot more unequal since the 1980s. The top 10% own almost half the wealth. In fact, last year it's been reported that they are owning half the wealth. So that's really quite significant. That's gone back and forth over time, but it's always been the wealthy that have owned most of everything. There was a time in America that was referred to as the Gilded Age. Mark Twain talked about it. It's an age that was like today, where we have what's seemingly an affluent society. We have most of the infrastructure that we need, the distribution of food and so on, but a lot of the poverty is actually hidden under a thin veneer of affluence. And a lot of people are leading lives that exist from paycheck to paycheck. Here's a copy of a report that came out just this summer that tackles the issues of inequality in Canada. You can click on this link to take a closer look at it. All right, the third major perspective in sociology is called symbolic interactionism. Unlike the preceding two, symbolic interactionism is all about micro analysis, going from the telescope to the microscope. And one of the ways in which this was demonstrated was in the work of a gentleman named Max Weber, and he said that, it's ideas, it's meanings, and it's the interpretation of ideas and the action that people take after interpreting things that accounts for the production of culture, the kind of definitions of situations that we use to understand who we are in our lives, explain our existence to ourselves, and how we fit in. So one of the things that Weber talked about in a book called The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism was that following from the Protestant Reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe, there were notions about individuals who were hardworking, who were thrifty, who saved, didn't spend ostentatiously, and accumulated a lot of capital. And that these individuals were the driving, and their belief, this is like another term for symbolic interactions, beliefs, thoughts, thinking, ideas, perceptions, concepts, definitions, that their belief in this ethic as part of their religious foundations, being humble and hardworking before God, proving themselves in this world by their industriousness, so that they could be taken into heaven upon salvation, was a fundamental value, idea, ideology that helped drive the development of capitalism in the Western world. So capitalism did not develop, as Marx argued, by the operation of economic forces alone. Weber didn't deny that. There were economic forces that had a huge impact, but it also depended deeply on the meanings that people attached to their lives and the significance of their work and the things that they did. And what Weber called this was Wehrstehen. What Weber did was emphasize the importance of empathetically, and I've got a little graphic here, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, of empathetically understanding people's motives and meanings that they attach to things in order to gain a clear understanding of the significance of their actions, so that it's not just forces that are macro in nature, it's not about rates, it's not about the economy and the distribution of wealth, it's also how people see their lives and what they attach as significant meanings to them. He called this aspect of his approach a methodology research, Wehrstehen. Wehrstehen. So yeah, here's the interesting thing about Germans and the pronunciations of W's and V's. It's backwards, and I only learned that when I started out as a first-year student at university studying sociology, and my introductory sociology professor, Dr. David Nock, explained that pronunciation to me. So we say Weber, and we say Wehrstehen, meaning deep understanding. So from a symbolic interactions point of view, we can say that if we take a look at macro-analysis, that suicide rates give us useful information, particularly about who might be at risk of death by suicide, say by various variables. You know, people who were single, males who are in their mid-50s, and so on. People who are clinically depressed may be at more risk. That's great stuff, but it's not at all anything about meanings that people would attribute to their self-destructive acts. So I have a little bit of an abstract of an article by a man named David Rosen. He's a medical doctor, and he did research on suicide, which would be kind of like what a symbolic interactionist would do. He went out and did interviews of survivors of serious suicide attempts to find out what exactly that meant to them, why, the reasons, the meanings, the understandings, the interpretations of their life events that led them to try and commit self-harm acts that were so dangerous it could have killed them. So, one of the magnets for suicide in North America is the Golden Gate Bridge. And there's one journalist, many years ago, I had this actual article somewhere in one of my filing cabinets. This journalist found 25 survivors of attempts up the Golden Gate Bridge. So they jumped off this bridge and they survived. And 13 of the 25 said that they had changed their mind about their intention to die on the way down. So essentially, what's going on in a person's mind is he's creating meaning all of the time. He's interpreting the events in his life, and those ideas and those interpretations of the events have significance for an impact on their actions. And by changing your mind on the way down at this micro level, what's going on is you're horrified now all of a sudden at the fact that you're plummeting only for a brief number of seconds to this concrete-like surface, because that's what it's like when you hit water from that height, that's likely to kill you, and now you don't want to die. So people are very ambiguous about their wishes to die. It's something that's used in suicide interventions. Talking therapies with suicide interventions is to draw out this ambiguity that people have, because we know a lot of people don't necessarily see a way out. But if we can draw on that ambiguity, maybe we can draw them to the side where their wish to die isn't quite as strong. So there's a famous novelist, Virginia Woolf, writing at the turn of the last century, and she died in 1941 of a suicide. And she left a suicide letter for her husband. She died of drowning. She had been depressed and had bouts of depression throughout her life. And so she wrote to her husband to tell him. This gives us this kind of micro level insight about something that would be of great interest to a symbolic interactionist who's studying suicide, the way that we get information about somebody who's thinking of killing themselves is to interview them if they've survived an attempt, and or to find suicide notes. Dearest, I feel certain that I'm going mad again. I feel we can't go through another of those terrible times, and I shan't recover this time. I begin to hear voices, and I can't concentrate. So I am doing what seems the best thing to do. You have given me the greatest possible happiness. You've been in every way all that anyone could be. I don't think two people could have been happier till this terrible disease came. I can't fight it any longer. I know that I am spoiling your life, that without me you could work. And you will, I know. You see, I can't even write this properly. I can't read. What I want to say is, I owe all the happiness of my life to you. You have been entirely patient with me and incredibly good. I want to say that everybody knows that. If anybody could have saved me, it would have been you. Everything is gone from me, but the certainty of your goodness. I can't go on spoiling your life any longer. I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been. Symbolic interactionism versus microdata. So here's the macro data. Macrodata doesn't tell us anything at all about one person's thoughts, feelings, or interpretation of events in his or her life, like our author's note. Instead, what we get is impersonal and aggregate. We get information about rates of death among whole subpopulations. And here's the different rates. Mood disorder, relationships with rates of suicide, and so on. Instead, in this regard, we can get the insight that those suffering from depression, like Virginia Woolf, are at much higher risk of death by suicide. Using this data has been helpful in developing intervention strategies. So we have value out of both kinds of sociological research. Interviews, ethnographies, plowing through people's letters, so on. And correlating that with the macro data. Extremely useful stuff. So symbolic interactionism focus on face-to-face communication, understanding people's subjective meanings, understanding that through their meaning structures, people create and respond to their circumstances. They don't simply react to them. And micro-level understandings validate meanings in smaller settings, marginal social groups, and unofficial viewpoints. What does it mean to be a member of a protest group that's marginal to society? And when we're studying things from a symbolic interactions point of view, we're going to go and take a look at people that are involved in these subcultures. Get their information, understand it from their perspective. What does it mean to be a member of a biker gang? Here's some data from the 2012 annual report of the coroner of New Brunswick about suicide rates in New Brunswick. In 2009, earlier, we saw that the Canadian rate of death by suicide was 9.5 per 100,000. And in New Brunswick, at the same time, it was 12.1. The rate of death by suicide was actually higher than the Canadian national average. Subjective meanings play a big part in how deaths are officially registered. Many are labeled as accidental deaths, and they might actually be suicide. So, here we have information in Schedule A1. The coroner's report has 5 ways in which you can list a death. Death by natural causes, death by accident, death by suicide, homicide, and a death that's undetermined cause. Another way in which we can do symbolic interactionist research or microanalytical understanding, develop microanalytical understandings of suicide is through psychological autopsies. Now, I used to know people that had been given a role as a provincial suicidologist. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find someone who's registered as a provincial suicidologist. All I was able to do was to get a hold of this crisis helpline number and this man whose primary contact with Gregory Zed, who's got a listing here in terms of what he does for addictions and mental health in Sussex, not for the province, because I believe we used to have a provincial suicidologist, but I couldn't find a name. So what a suicidologist will do is, in the wake of a suicide, he will conduct a psychological autopsy. He will go out and he will talk to the family. He will ask for information about the individual. He will look for any indication of whether or not the person left a suicide note. He'll try and construct a cause of death based on that person's, what kind of meanings might have been created in that person's mind leading up to the self-harm act that resulted in his death. Was he suffering from mental health illnesses? Was he having problems at work? Was he having relationship problems, he or she? What was it that was going on in that person's life? Did they have a gambling addiction issue? Did they have multiple addiction issues? And so on. So understanding why someone attempted suicide or committed suicide complements the data we get from simply crunching the numbers. For instance, after a psychological autopsy, it might be found that many deaths could be related to gambling addictions, and indeed that does happen. It's just something we don't get from the raw data. Another way in which symbolic interactionists might do research is called participant observation. And here is a book that was written by a gentleman, came out in the early 1960s. I read it this summer, by John Howard Griffin, called Black Like Me. Through a process of injections, some pigmentation, sun tanning, what he did was he darkened his skin rather significantly. So here he is, and he was able to pass as a black person in the South. And he went through a number of states, Mississippi in particular, and he was able to see what it was like from the perspective of a black person, and how by passing as a black person in that community, going from one day to the next, how he ended up being treated differently as a black person. And then he wrote this revealing book, which was made him a big figure in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Feminist theory. Like almost all of our history up into the last century, women have played very subservient roles in our society. Essentially, when we talk about male-dominated society, we're talking about a term that feminists and sociologists like to use, which is patriarchal society. Pater in Latin meaning father, and arche, overreaching, just generally. So most of the contributions that women have made were either attributed to men, or women were just overlooked in terms of the work that they did. One of the early sociologists who did work was Harriet Martineau, who ironically enough is probably remembered and is always mentioned for translating Auguste Comte's work from French into English. But she was a researcher and a writer and a feminist in her own right. And one of the things that she said, the sum and substance of female education in America, as in England, is training women to consider marriage as the sole object in life, and to pretend that they do not think so. Feminist theory, a fourth sociological tradition, emerged in time since I started studying sociology. It focuses on patriarchy, which is the system of male domination in society. seen as important as class inequality in determining a woman's life chances. So what does it mean? What does life chances mean? Life chances mean that if you were a woman, essentially you were discriminated against almost to the same extent as if you were a person from a visible minority who was being discriminated against in our society. You have to be better, you have to work harder, and you still are going to be dealing with old school networks or something called the glass ceiling in terms of trying to get ahead. So there are structures of power in our society that are male dominated that are not about biology but about power, that account for the inequality between men and women. So men enjoy in our society more economic power, more legal power, more political power, and more cultural privileges. However much society is changing, it's still a matter of the pendulum swinging. Feminist analysis is both macro and micro, and they have championed symbolic interactionists, micro-level analysis like ethnographies, studying people, interviews, and so on, what's called qualitative research, and understanding things from people's perspectives, as well as using macro data. And they believe that existing patterns of inequality can be changed. So one example of inequality between men and women is the pay equity issue. So just generally across Canada, women, on average, make less than men. And the New Brunswick Coalition for Pay Equity a number of years ago had a poster out, and the poster said, if you have a son and a daughter, for every dollar you give your son as allowance, give your daughter 78 cents. That was a reflection of the difference in the pay equity between men and women at the time. Okay, something that's not talked about in this chapter as one of the perspectives, theoretical perspectives in sociology, was talked about in culture, is postmodernism. Some sociology textbooks in the last decade have had postmodernism as a perspective in sociology, and this one doesn't. Some don't. Some sociologists think a new term is needed to characterize the nature of our times, and that term is called postmodernism, which is an eclectic mix of things from different times and places. So here's, for example, a picture of the Royal Ontario Museum with some really modern architecture coupled with this old Victorian architecture. Postmodernism involves generally a sense of the erosion of authority. There were protests at the G20 Toronto Summit. There were a lot of people there who were protesting inequality around the world, and that's just an example. Postmodernism is characterized by a decline of consensus around core values. One of those core values is an acknowledgement of authorities and of experts. So half a century ago, Canadians were more likely to defer to authorities in family, schools, politics, and medicine. This kind of consensus has been eroding. One area where authorities have been increasingly challenged is in mandatory vaccines. So people, for their skepticism around authorities and people telling them that vaccines are safe, have decided to raise their children without getting vaccines. And we're seeing the resurgence of some diseases that are almost all but eradicated, such as whooping cough in North America. Postmodernism involves an eclectic mix from different times and places. It involves people adopting their own individual belief systems, such as their spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs, by blending facets of different cultures and historical periods. People consider religion in very unconventional kinds of ways. They take and mix and mash things together in whatever kind of way suits their sense of spirituality or their awe of the fact that they're alive. Yet they may still go and get married in a church. So they may do some very traditional things, but may only show up at church at Christmas and get married in a church. They pick and choose what they want. So one author writing at Baylor University, teaching preaching and worship, wrote that he's taken the analogy of mashups in the music industry, And what emerges are people creating engaging ways of communicating that thrive at the intersection of religion and popular culture, but keep alive the deepest theological truths, like a quest for awe about the meaning of life and so on. Postmodernism involves the erosion of authority. So aside from the G20 summit disturbances, we had students in Quebec in 2012 protesting tuition rises. And there's a little bit of data here about that. It involves some demonstrations and occupations and student strikes, flash mobs and barricades and so on. There were 23 injuries. 2,500 people were arrested. So Canadians are becoming even more skeptical of authority than Americans, especially in politics. So we're participating more in demonstrations, and our voting has declined. So that shows you a sense of the eroding authority in Canadian society. Very postmodernist kind of trends. Postmodernism is also characterized by a decline of consensus around our core values. People are picking and choosing their own kind of morality. It becomes more local. Postmodernists say, well, who are you to tell me that my beliefs are wrong? There's a kind of relativism that exists there. Some of the big historical projects that failed, like Nazism, communism, and the colonial rule, also created a sense that there are issues with progress, and big historical projects don't work, and that scientific advances don't work. And this has some negative consequences, to believe in the idea that science will solve our problems. So skepticism in science is big. One way to appreciate how skepticism for science has emerged is to consider what the promise of nuclear power was to solve energy needs in the world. So what we can do is take a look at manifest and latent functions. When something has a manifest function, and I grew up at the dawn of the advent of the nuclear age, and I can remember essentially what our propaganda videos. Here's a propaganda video for nuclear power. In the early development of nuclear power capabilities, it was touted as promising. It was cheap. It was going to be reliable. It was going to be safe. It was going to be clean. And the whole manifest function, manifestly, the purpose for this is this. Manifest means it's something that's up there in your face. Here are the reasons why we are doing it, and these are what's going to be the result. We're going to go into a new modern age of cheap, reliable energy and a better future for everyone. That was the manifest ideas of having nuclear power. Manifest functions are the intended purpose. The production of electrical power, the production of radioactive isotopes used in medical imaging, all of these things were going to be great. Canada is one of the major providers of medical imaging radioisotopes, and it comes out of the Chalk River Laboratory, which now is scheduled to be closed. Medical radioisotopes, that's a good thing. That helps people detect diseases like cancers and have them treated early so that they can survive. Those are manifest functions. But latently, the latent function are the things that are unforeseen, unintended, that people didn't realize that the implementations of these technologies would produce problems. Unforeseen consequences in the development and use of nuclear energy represents the latent functions that are associated with its use. What are the latent consequences? What were the things that, if they had a crystal ball, these things, when they had the whole idea about what was going to be good or manifest, were invisible to them. These are unintended. The inevitable accidents that have occurred at nuclear plants, like meltdowns at Chernobyl, releases of radioactive gas, hot gases from over boilers that are getting overheated, storage of spent fuel bundles, storage of contaminated items, workers' clothing, contaminated water, contaminated steam discharges, and then the consequences of disasters, floods, and tornadoes and earthquakes at sites where nuclear reactors exist, like Fukushima. And then what happens is when you have a meltdown at Chernobyl, you have radioactive fallout, and then large areas, like in areas around Chernobyl in Ukraine, in areas around Fukushima in Japan, that become sacrifice zones. So irradiated that people can't live there, and they just have to be given up. Canada's reactor at Chalk River Laboratory actually suffered a leak of contaminated heavy water. It had to be shut down in 2009. The lengthy delays in getting it back up produced a period of about 15 months where there was a shortage of radioisotopes all around the world. People weren't getting diagnosed with their scans to see what kind of problems they had with their diseases. All of these are what we call latent functions. As much as science proposes advances with manifest functions for a better world, latent functions such as nuclear accidents or unknowns about effects of genetically modified products that we consume produce fears and skepticism about scientists, and fears and skepticism about the authorities who propose that moving forward with these things is good. So that typically is what postmodernism is about. So today's sociological ideas are influenced by the social setting in which they emerge. And sociology was born out of a confluence of what I like to call the perfect storm of revolutions: the scientific revolution, the democratic revolution, industrial revolution, urbanization, secularism. So the promise of sociology in its inception was to uncover scientific laws like we found in the harder sciences, much like the law of gravity. Discoveries in biology helped to revolutionize medicine and technology and the frontiers of our understanding. We hope sociology would do the same.